You think you have a military option against us? Look at Gaza.
We did see extremely defiant images of the people marching back. We did see Hamas coming out with almost pristine clothing after Israel had completely bludgeoned the north of Gaza. Like, just where were these Hamas fighters? How did they manage to evade all of this?
I believe that they will, because they will get the okay from Trump. They will annex the West Bank. Israel's happy with the ceasefire. Why not? The people will be there. There will be no food, no water, no fuel, no electricity. There will be no shelter. And at some point, there will be only two options left for the people of Gaza. But I think the Saudis are worried that if they enter into an alliance with Israel, their role is going to be as slaves.
I've already told you this, but I'm really impressed by the patience you've displayed and continue to display throughout this entire day.
No problem.
All right, I am rolling over here.
Okay, do you want to do this clap thing? Okay, so there we go, we're starting. Hello, good day, welcome back to Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ashfaq Kareem, and today I'm with Normal Finkelstein, who really needs no introduction, especially in the last 15 months. He's been one of the most sort of acclaimed voices speaking out against Israel's atrocities and giving information about what's happening in Gaza and everything else. Norman Finkelstein, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. It's going to be a long conversation, and so thanks in advance for that. Our aim during the next sort of 2.5, maybe even 3 hours, is to take stock of the events that's occurred in the last year from your perspective. Try to understand those events in a historical context. Assess how changes in the region and in the US will impact the way forward. And also just to get to understand why you have taken such a deep interest in understanding the conflict. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, just to begin with, it's almost about 16 months, not even 15 months anymore, since October the 7th. There's a very fragile ceasefire in place. Whether it's even a ceasefire, if that's the right terminology, I guess we'll get to start speaking about that. We are likely to see increased escalations of violence in the West Bank. Trump is now the president of the US, and he has said that we should clear out Gaza, whatever that may mean. When you just look at everything that's going on here, what's your immediate sort of take on current events?
Immediate take on current events is that I do not believe that there is grounds for optimism. Of course, one wants the ceasefire. About that, there should be no dispute, no quarrel, no disagreement. Those people have suffered an unspeakable horror for the past 16 months, and a ceasefire, however temporary, is of course to be welcomed. Even during the Vietnam War, of which I have vivid memories, there would occasionally be what was called, for example, the Christmas ceasefire, when the United States stopped its bombing of Vietnam. Now, everybody knew that the bombing would resume when the Christmas season passed, but certainly nobody begrudged the fact that the people, even however temporarily, were being able to get up in the morning and not have bombs dropping on their head, or to go to sleep at night and not have artillery shells directed against them. However, having said that, and not relishing the role of the messenger of bad news, I just don't believe there's any grounds for optimism, for a very simple reason. And the reason is this: Israel's happy with the ceasefire. Why not? The people will be there. There will be no food, no water, no fuel, no electricity. There will be no shelter. And at some point, there will be only two options left for the people of Gaza. One, to leave, or two, Hamas resumes its armed resistance, and then Israel will have the pretext for round two in the horrors. Now, you may object to what I'm saying on the grounds that, but the ceasefire incorporated humanitarian assistance and eventually reconstruction in Gaza. I don't believe that's going to be remembered. After Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, the Israelis had to decide whether to agree to a ceasefire. And the ceasefire included provisions for ending the criminal blockade of Gaza. And the defense minister of the time was Ehud Barak. And Ehud Barak famously said to the Knesset when they were debating whether to sign the ceasefire, he said, in order to encourage them to agree to it, he said, once a ceasefire is in place, everybody forgets about the rest. What you agreed to, everybody forgets it. And that's what's going to happen here. If bombs aren't dropping, if people aren't dying of violent death, which one has to distinguish from a death from starvation, if bombs aren't dropping, if people aren't dying of violent death, then it disappears from the headlines. Once the hostages, and on both sides the hostages are exchanged, it disappears from the headlines. And the only time it will reappear is if Hamas then says, what happened to the humanitarian aid? What happened to the reconstruction? Because Israel won't allow it. Of course it won't allow it. We have a long history. One of the sad things about listening to pundits discuss the matter is they have no knowledge whatsoever of the history. There was an agreement to lift the criminal blockade of Gaza after Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9. After the Mavi Marmara incident, when the humanitarian flotilla came under attack from Israel and it created an international scandal, there was an agreement to lift the blockade. After Operation Pillar of Defense, after Operation Protective Edge in 2014, nothing came of it. It's all exactly, very cynical, but very true what Barak says. Ehud Barak said, the defense minister, once the prime minister, he said, once the ceasefire is in place, everybody forgets the rest. And after Operation Protective Edge in 2014, there were provisions to ease the blockade of Gaza. And as we all know, nothing came of it. And that was actually the preamble to the Great March of Return in March 2018, the attempt to get that blockade lifted. And actually, I think that was the main stimulus behind the attack on October 7th, that blockade of Gaza. So I see no reason to anticipate that what happened multiple times in the past won't happen again. The humanitarian aid, yes, the first few days they're going to let in humanitarian aid. Then they're going to conjure excuses. They're going to say that Hamas is stealing the aid. They're going to say that we can't admit cement because Hamas will use it to reconstruct the tunnel system. And all sorts of pretexts will be created. And then the people are going to be faced with a very dire choice, whether to stay and starve and be homeless, or to figure out a way to leave. And for Hamas, there will be the stark choice of honor the ceasefire, notwithstanding that all the other provisions under stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3, all the other provisions are discarded.
I do share your lack of optimism simply because of the history. I mean, I think, though, just to not to sort of challenge what you say, but just to kind of, because I actually agree with it, but just to kind of give it more nuance, right? It's the question of feasibility. So it was feasible for Israel previously to do what they did. Because the people in Gaza, while they had a very minuscule life and a very sort of limited life, did have a life. They did have homes. While they couldn't be given, coriander and spices, they could get other spices and they could exist. Right now, it's completely rubble. We're still going to get to, and we're still going to speak about the fact that there has been a lot of just defiant symbolism that's come out from the people of Palestine and from Hamas fighters. But it just doesn't seem feasible anymore. And at the same time, given the defiance we saw of the people marching back to not their homes, but what remains of their homes, it may not even be feasible to move them out because there will be resistance, just humane, reluctance because of the whole history of the Nakba and everything else. So just in terms of feasibility, what sort of is this tug of war between, I think, the Israeli plan, which has been clearly stated multiple times since October 7th, if not before, to move them to Sinai or somewhere else, to move the people of Gaza somewhere else. And Trump is now, echoing what was said by his predecessor to some extent, but just a lot more blatantly, as Trump usually does. And the desire, and just sort of there's going to be this tug of war, right, on feasibility. So when you add that into the equation, where do you see this going?
That's a fair question. Where I see it going is as follows. If everything can be done by Israel below the radar, that is to say, without getting any camera coverage of what's going on, they will just persist in their path of making Gaza first unlivable, and then second, facilitating the expulsion, de facto expulsion of the population in Gaza. The one variable which my friend Muin Rabbani caused me to think about was the fact that Trump certainly knows that the Gaza question became a escalating catastrophe for Joe Biden, the previous president, and that public opinion was not overwhelmingly, but certainly substantially, preponderantly opposed to what Israel was doing, which would make it hard for Trump to give blanket support to Israel in the event that hostilities erupted again. And so Trump doesn't want the Gaza albatross on his watch. Now, it only becomes an albatross if Gaza is above the radar in terms of news coverage. Otherwise, nobody will even know what's going on. It's not as if the American media or the European media are eager to expose Israel's continued master plan to, by hook or by crook, ethnically cleanse Gaza. There were three aspects. I should clarify it. There were three aspects to the reaction by Israel after October 7th. The first and the most obvious was simply blood revenge. It was not only what the Gazans had done on October 7th, but that outrage was multiplied 1,000-fold by the fact that it was Untermenschen, subhumans, these Untermenschen in Gaza had not only carried out the operation on October 7th, but had exposed the Ubermensch, the supermen, had exposed the weaknesses of the chinks in the armor of Israel, that this cutting edge, high-tech society with all of its razzmatazz, technological razzmatazz, had been outsmarted and outwitted by the Untermenschen, by the subhumans in Gaza. So the blood revenge, which you'd say is normal, I suppose, was multiplied 1,000-fold by the racist Ubermenschen, supermen mentality of the Israelis. So that was, and it continues to be, a major factor in the Israeli reaction. Secondly, there was the feeling among Israelis that what they call their deterrence capability, their ability to terrorize the Arab world, had been significantly undermined by what happened October 7th, because the thought now began to percolate in the minds of many Arabs that maybe there's a military option against Israel. Maybe it's not militarily invincible. If Hamas, a ragtag semi-guerrilla army, could carry out this operation, so the idea begins to percolate that Israel is not the invincible force that we believed in it. And so Israel had to use the terminology that's commonly resorted to, it had to restore its deterrence capability. It had to remind the Arabs who's in charge, the Arabs and Muslims who's in charge. And basically, the message it wanted to transmit was, you think you have a military option against us? Look at Gaza, or what remains of Gaza. And the third goal was, as with every crisis, there is a cliche that a crisis is also an opportunity, or can be made into an opportunity. And the crisis of October 7th was now conceived by the Israeli leadership as an opportunity. And the opportunity was to once and for all solve the Gaza question, for once and for all. Up until October 7th, Israel, to use its terminology, periodically mowed the lawn in Gaza, which is basically high-tech killing sprees. I referred to them already earlier, there were many operations. I mean, there are so many that try as I could never commit them to memory because there are so many. But the ones that are most salient were Operation Cast Lead, Pillar of Defense, Protective Edge. These were high-tech killing sprees. But now Israel resolved, we're not going to mow the lawn any longer in Gaza. We're going to extirpate. That means pull out by the root. We're going to extirpate every blade of grass in Gaza. And that remains Israel's goal. It's not changed. I mean, sometimes you listen to people, these pundits, and they say, well, it's hard to predict what's going to happen in stage 2 and 3. Hard to predict? Do you really believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his entourage, or Israeli society in general, do you really believe they had a revelation, an epiphany, and now they're going to, in the immortal words of John Lennon, give peace a chance? No, that's not going to happen. They're going to try to achieve their goal, which remains unshakable, of resolving the Gaza question once and for all. And the only constraint is going to be that if the situation once again gets out of hand and garners news coverage, that President Trump will probably step in because he doesn't want the Gaza albatross. He already saw that it did a lot of damage to the Biden administration, and he doesn't want to go through that again.
What do you think? I mean, you've mentioned earlier that in many ways the ceasefire is kind of convenient. The ceasefire definitely did coincide with Trump coming into power, which happened it was announced just a week before he came into power, and it went into effect the day before he came into power. What do you think kind of accelerated that beyond the fact that it's kind of convenient for Israel? Has it got to do with Saudi pressure? I mean, he's also announced that the Saudis will invest $600 billion and he's asked for $1 trillion. And I mean, and why I'm asking the question, it's just to kind of push back a little bit again at your second point, that Israel have tried to make an example of Gaza to kind of tell the Arab world, don't mess with us. But hasn't it maybe just achieved the other objective, from the sense of, we once thought you may be a reasonable person or actor in the region. And so as much as, a lot of the Arab states have sort of collaborated with Israel against the Palestinians, they thought they were maybe doing it with the kind of belligerent but rational person. But now they're like, if this entity is so irrational, are we safe collaborating with them to an extent? Not that they have also sort of gotten a conscience suddenly, but just from their own sort of preservation perspective. And secondly, despite what they did to Gaza, which is really, really bad and really, really horrible, and I don't think it's possible for us to quantify it, and I dare say not even people in Gaza have maybe processed just how horrible it is, right? But I mean, we did see extremely defiant images of the people marching back. We did see Hamas coming out with almost pristine clothing after Israel had completely bludgeoned the north of Gaza. Like, just where were these Hamas fighters? How did they manage to evade all of this? So in a way, just to push back, and very gently to push back, because I do agree with the momentum of where your argument's going. Like, sometimes there's almost a Murphy's Law, or like a point of irony, because despite the savagery, Hamas is still seemingly, I wouldn't say intact, but just not at all completely destroyed. And the Palestinians are very defiant, and there's probably a lot more mistrust by actors in the region, even if they're hiding that mistrust, on how they feel about Israel.
Okay, let's begin with the first question. I'm not sure why you would classify Israel as having revealed itself to being an irrational actor with whom the Arab regimes may have trouble uh, negotiating and allying with. There's nothing irrational about what they're doing. Ethnic cleansings happen. Genocides happen. Blood revenge happens. Except for the blood revenge aspect, which is, as I said, almost an innate human impulse, although here compounded by the racism. It only becomes irrational if there's no connect between the means and the ends. But there is a connect. The connect is Israel wants to solve the Gaza question. That's a perfectly rational objective, and it's resolved to solve the Gaza question by three means. One, ethnic cleansing. The last figure I read, which was just a few days ago, is about 200,000 Palestinians in Gaza have fled already, about a tenth of the population. So ethnic cleansing. Two, making Gaza unlivable, as one senior Israeli put it, to give the people of Gaza the option of to stay and starve or to leave. And the third is just mass murder, outright genocide. So there's nothing irrational either about their objective or about the means they have chosen to achieve that objective. Where a problem arises, in my opinion, but I've not studied it closely enough to give a definite judgment, is here I agree with you that I think the Saudis are beginning to have second thoughts about allying too much with Israel, because although they wanted Israel and the US as a counterweight to Iran, the fact is that the so-called resistance alliance was resistance axis was so weakened by the past 15 months that I think the Saudis are worried that if they enter into an alliance with Israel, their role is going to be as slaves. There's no counterweight any longer in the region to these Israeli Übermenschen. There's no counterweight. And with the absence of any counterweight, the only role that Saudi can play in an alliance with Israel will be the role of slaves. And I don't think they want that option. So ironically, even though the Saudis wanted the alliance with the US and Israel as a counterweight to the axis of resistance, I think now they're a little worried that the axis has been weakened too much and that Israel is going to carry on in a fashion even more arrogant than it has hitherto. The second question is, it's kind of a psychological question. And I have to admit that I don't have necessarily the discernment powers to answer it. So let me just say two things. Number one, I obviously have studied the matter quite closely, and I have a pretty clear picture. After Operation pillar of defense in 2012. It didn't last long. It lasted 6 days, if my memory is right. And afterwards, the people celebrated in the streets. They were euphoric. They had held off Israel. And the Israeli leadership at the time looked quite pitiful when Operation Pillar of Defense ended. Operation Protective Edge was different. Now, just to give you the relative numbers, Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, about 350 children are killed, 6,000 homes are demolished, and 600,000 tons of rubble are left behind. That's Cast Lead. Operation Protective Edge, it's about 550 children killed, 18,000 homes destroyed or severely damaged, and about 2.5 million tons of rubble. Each time it was seen by the world as an unspeakable horror. You're probably too young to even remember Operation Cast Lead, but that caused huge demonstrations around the world at what Israel was doing. After Protective Edge, the head of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, his name is Peter Maurer, and he went to observe what happened in Gaza during Protective Edge. And he stated, I've never seen destruction like this ever before. Bear in mind, this is the guy who goes to combat zones as a professional, as his professional, his CV as the head of the ICRC. He said, I've never seen such destruction ever before. Now, in the current situation, it's not 18,000 homes that were destroyed in Gaza. It's about 300,000. It's not 550 children who have been killed. It's probably on the order of 15,000. It's not 2.5 tons of rubble. It's 50 million tons of rubble. Why do I mention all this? Because after Protective Edge, when people came out of their shelters in Gaza, or where they were secluding themselves, they weren't shelters, obviously, where they were secluding themselves, and they looked around, popular support for Gaza, for Hamas, precipitously dropped. They hadn't realized what happened during those 51 days of Protective Edge. They hadn't realized it. My guess, but these are matters of psychology, and I don't pretend to any kind of expertise. My guess is once the dust has settled and they see what's happened, I think there may be a decline of spirits and support for Hamas. That's my guess. But I said I have to be careful about these things because during the war in Vietnam, one of the things that everybody wondered, how did these people maintain their esprit de corps in the face of the United States dropping the equivalent of 2 atomic bombs on Vietnam every month? Yours generation has no concept, not even a clue of an idea of the horror that the US inflicted on Vietnam, which defined my whole generation. But the people managed to persist, to persevere until they finally inflicted that military defeat on Vietnam. Even that, I have to say, has to be qualified. Professor Chomsky, who many of your listeners will know, Professor Chomsky, who was one of the leading figures opposing the war in Vietnam, his opinion was the Vietnamese lost the war because all the kinds of social transformations and aspirations that they had for the people. It was obvious. It was called the National Liberation Struggle. It was also supposed to be a socialist struggle. There was nothing left. There was nothing left of their aspirations. You can say, they won the battles. That's true. But at the end of the day, they lost the war. So that's how I see it.
You speak, and we've seen the massive destruction that Israel has put on Gaza, and we haven't seen, in fact, we've seen the opposite in terms of Israeli society being disturbed by their leadership. They've supported them, they've cheered them on to a very large extent. All polling shows that. Increasingly, there's a discussion in Israel and in Washington about annexing the West Bank. And given the precedent of that Israel's been able to get away with, yes, there's been judgments and almost judgments in the ICJ. There's been protests around the world, but given the precedent that they've been able to get away with this, do you see them doing something similar in the West Bank, or what would be their strategy to sort of annex the West Bank? Give it that I think both of us understand that Israel's always kind of playing this game of let's try to achieve our goals as soon as possible, but also by not upsetting the ability for us to achieve that, right? So given that equation, what do you think? How do you think they go about achieving their goals in the West Bank?
First of all, you will recall I said that the Israeli leadership, the day after October 7th, just like incidentally my own government's reaction to 9/11. They shed a few salty tears, and then all the folks in the Situation Room, as it's called, be it Donald Rumsfeld, be it Mr. Cheney, and all the others, they rubbed their palms of their hands in eager anticipation. So how can we capitalize on 9/11? And the Israelis, the same, a few salty tears, some genuine, and then some counterfeit indignation. And then, as I said, they're going to solve the Gaza question. But then as time elapsed, they discovered they can solve some other questions. They thought maybe we can solve the Hezbollah question. And maybe the big Megillah, we can solve the Iran question. So they saw progressively more opportunities as time elapsed. And now a new opportunity, the annexation. First of all, we should be clear about technical terminology. Israel has annexed the West Bank already. It's annexed territory because under international law, what distinguishes an annexation from an occupation is very simple. What distinguishes an occupation from annexation is occupations are supposed to be temporary. If it's not temporary, then it's not an occupation. It's an annexation, an illegal annexation. Israel has made clear its occupation is not temporary. It's not going anywhere. So it has annexed those territories as a factual matter. They are annexed to Israel. And I don't believe we should continue to use the expression OPT, occupied Palestinian territories, because that obscures what's really going on. It's annexed territories. They are part of Israel. As B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for the Occupied Territories, about, I don't even know, time goes so quickly at my age, I can't remember, but probably around 7 years ago, it put out a position paper. And the position paper, I thought it was very simple, not a typical legal document with 10,000 footnotes. Very simple. The head of B'Tselem at the time was this guy named Haggai Elad, who was a PhD in physics from Harvard University. Very smart guy and very principled guy. But you could see he had no patience with the legal mumbo jumbo. He said, and I advise your listeners to go back and look at the paper. He said, there's just one state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. There is just one state. It's the state of Israel. And its foundation, he said, is Jewish supremacy. Its foundation, it's built on the principle of Jewish supremacy. And then recently I listened to the Israeli journalist Gideon Levy, and I thought he correctly said, he said, Zionism means only one thing today. Don't go back and look at what Herzl said. Don't go back and look at what Pinsker said. Don't go back and look at what Ahad Ha'am said. Don't go back and look at what Jabotinsky said. He said it only means one thing today. Zionism means Jewish supremacy. And Jewish supremacy from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. So the area is already annexed de facto. De jure, I believe that they will, because they will get the okay from Trump, they will annex the West Bank, again, with the one caveat, that is, Trump does not want to have the Israel-Palestine albatross around his neck for his new term of office. He saw with Biden, it can cause a lot of damage. So if they can do it in one stroke and then it disappears from the headlines. Remember, they annexed Trump in his first term of office. He moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. He acknowledged the Israeli annexation of Jerusalem, which occurred in 1969. I mean, it's a long time ago. He went along with it. What happened? Nothing. Did President Biden reverse it? Did he undo it? He could have. He could have simply nullified what Trump's recognition of Israel's control of incorporation of East Jerusalem. He could have annulled it. He didn't. And so the Israelis might, I think probably not might, probably will annex legally, because de facto it's a done deal. It's a fait accompli. Legally, they may do it, and Trump will recognize it unless there is an formidable, not just a reaction, another UN General Assembly resolution condemning it, another UN Security Council resolution expressing disappointment, which will, of course, be vetoed by the United States. Yes, they'll do it. I don't believe it makes a difference. It's already annexed territory. The International Court of Justice already ruled in July 2024, the ICJ already ruled that Israel's occupation, it didn't speak to annexation, I think incorrectly, but that's a separate issue. It already ruled that the occupation is illegal under international law and that Israel has to expeditiously, as soon as possible, to leave. So if they already ruled that an occupation is illegal, then obviously the annexation will be illegal. So it doesn't really change anything, in my opinion. It doesn't change anything. Was anything dramatically changed by Trump's recognition of Israel's control or incorporation of East Jerusalem? No, it didn't change anything. And the Democratic Party went along with it. Biden could have reversed, he didn't.
Just in terms of on the ground and what practically may happen. I mean, and it's kind of connected to the question of Gaza as well, because let's just assume that the fait accompli unfortunately does occur, and Israelis.
Which fait accompli are you referring to?
I'm talking about people in Gaza actually moving out of Gaza, right? Which is the plan, and there's lots of pressure and conditions are being created so that becomes a fait accompli. But let's assume
there is no grounds whatsoever to believe that Israel has changed its goal.
No, absolutely. I completely agree with you on that. But you see, it will impact Egypt, right? Because where will these Palestinians go? They would need to settle somewhere. I can't answer
that, but I'll tell you, we have to bear in mind that in the Middle East, there have been vast population transfers in recent years. About 2 million Syrians in Turkey, about 1.5 million Syrians in Lebanon. There have been vast population movements. So I don't think we can rule out the possibility, though, of course, I would be the first to acknowledge that this would involve problems, obviously, which is why Jordan and Egypt are averse to that solution. So I know that I don't pretend these will be easy matters to resolve, but I don't see. If Israel made an investment for 15 months to obliterate Gaza, basically to pulverize, to obliterate it, can any person seriously believe after that they're going to allow for Gaza's reconstruction? Now, that would be completely irrational, to go back to what you spoke to earlier. That would be a completely irrational act by Israel, and I don't believe it's going to happen.
Let's just play out what you said in terms of the challenges with Egypt and Jordan, right? Because for two reasons, it's different to Syria, because Syria is not. People were fleeing; they were fleeing a devastating war. Initially, these refugees were welcomed. And then obviously, as they stayed for longer, there were tensions among the local population and the governments, and they wanted them to go back. And Syria isn't Israel. It's not Syria. While Syria had a very bad leader who used to suppress his people, it's not a case of Palestinians being ethnically cleansed by settler colonialists. And this is part of the reason why there's reluctance to take Palestinians in, as you know. So that will impact dynamics in Jordan and in Egypt if some sort of accommodation has to be made. But all of these things creates a resistance to Israel's intentions. While the Egyptians and Jordanians, I think we both agree, are not at all sort of well-intentioned actors in this. They need to be realistic actors, and they need to stay in charge of their countries. So
we're totally in agreement. I can't answer the how. I know what the objective is. How they hope to achieve it, I can't answer that. I recognize both Egypt and Jordan will reckon a massive influx of Palestinians as being a a, uh, a a disruption of those societies on a very significant level. There will be a kind of insurrectionary element added to the regimes which are already profoundly unpopular. And the second reason, obviously, is they don't want to end up like Sadat with bullets in their head. So there's an element of self-preservation there on a very personal level. Or as King Abdullah in 1951 from Jordan, met his fate with an assassin's bullet. So yes, I think it will be a difficult thing to pull off. I recognize that, but I don't see the alternative. Let in humanitarian aid, allow for the reconstruction. Do you realize by 20 by 2023, by October 2023, Gaza hadn't yet reconstructed from protective hedge. I think it was about 70 or 80% reconstructed from protective hedge. And that was about a decade later, and it was 2.5 million tons of rubble. Now it's 50 million tons of rubble. I just think, I'm not a civil engineer. I'm just looking at what the UN is saying. They're saying 15 years just to remove the rubble. Forget about reconstruction. I don't see how that's possible. And even before possible, Israel did not spend 15 months obliterating Gaza in order to reconstruct it.
In terms of taking a look at Israel's sort of like, how does it become part of the region, and is it able to stay there for a long period of time? Is there a fair argument in saying that its actions in the last 15 months has made that an impossibility? That yes, even if it achieves these goals, which I do believe they intend to, they will now always be seen as this imposition in the region that's extremely violent, that you cannot trust. What's the outcome 60 years from now? Whereas while they were behaving extremely badly and irrationally before 15 months ago, maybe then there was a chance that Israel, you could see it as a country being there maybe a century from now. Bear in mind that these are very arbitrary timelines, and 100 years from now, the borders of the entire world as we know it may not exist as they are. But just the idea of a Jewish state now being in that part of the world, is it sustainable, like in the long arc of history?
I can't answer that. I don't know about long arcs of history. I'm at that point in time where I'm very happy if I remember what happened in the morning. So I can't speak to long arcs of history. What I know is, and here I'm not going to be facetious, even though I do have trouble remembering what happened in the morning. Countries are capable of change. We've seen it in our lifetime. We saw it with, first of all, the two countries who are constantly at war in Europe were Germany and France. The idea of a war now between Germany and France is unthinkable. The two regimes which represented, I think, the culmination of all the underside of Western civilization, and not just Western civilization, the two most racist and imperialist regimes of the interwar period, by far, or I don't want to say by far, let's just say the two most, were Germany and Japan. The horrors they committed are really, by any reckoning, I'm not going to whitewash the British, the famines they caused in places like India, and all sorts of other things. But I think it's fair to say that Germany and Japan represented the most racist and imperialist, okay, not imperialist, that's unfair, the most racist regimes on the planet during the interwar period. It's forgotten. The Japanese killed about 25 million Chinese during World War II. That's not a small number. The Germans, they killed, the estimates now are 27 or so million Russians during World War II. And I'm leaving aside the industrial extermination of the Jews. But I think it's fair to say that Japan and Germany, for all their limitations and for all their flaws, are among the most sane of the industrialized powers. Now, don't tell me about Germany and Gaza and Germany. I know all of it. I know all of it. But I think it's still fair to say that Germany and Japan are at the Pacific end of the political spectrum and have been since World War II. South Africa, another miraculous transformation of a country. And in my own country, the transformation of the American South. The American South was a very ugly place. So when we carried out in our country lynchings of African Americans, some people think the lynchings were Klansmen, those were the white supremacists, wearing white sheets at night, carrying torches, and executing these lynchings. But that's not how it happened. You know what a lynching was like in the American South? It was a holiday. Factories were let out early. Schools were let out early. Mothers packed their picnic baskets. They went to the campgrounds. The African American is strung up, then set on agonizing fire before he's been his last breath. And then afterwards, the lynched person, his body parts were auctioned off. Somebody would buy the liver, somebody would buy the heart, and then they would take photographs holding the liver, holding a heart, and they would use it as postcards. Now, the American South has undergone a profound transformation. So I don't believe in these notions of original sin. That is, you have the mark of Cain and you can never change. No, history shows peoples, nations, countries, they change. It can change. So I don't want to say Israel can never be reformed or radically transformed. I would say on its current trajectory, where it's becoming more and more not just a lunatic state, a lunatic society, which is different. You know, there's some times where one ought to make the distinction between a state and a society. During the war in Vietnam, at least during its peak, even though the state was committed to carrying out this horror in Vietnam, there was a significant dissent in society. There's no significant dissent in Israel. None. I don't want to say none at all, but I think the entirety of the principal dissent can fit in one room of my apartment. It's a completely lunatic society. And There's a second very important point. They pay no consequences. I was speaking to an Israeli, a very decent guy, the other day, I should say a couple of weeks ago now. And he said to me, I don't want to give his name because I don't want to cause him trouble. He's an academic in Israel. But he said to me, in Israel now, he's referring before the ceasefire. He says, Israel just goes on as normal. There's not even any sense of what's going on in Gaza. None whatsoever. There are no consequences for their actions. So, given the absence of consequences, yes, there's no reason to be optimistic. But were it forced to pay a price, and then people start doing the cost-benefit analysis, as South Africa did, as white folks in the American South did, and if there's a determined leadership forcing them to do the cost-benefit analysis, then, yeah, I think Israel could change. It's theoretically possible. When I say theoretically possible, I say that on the basis of historical experience. Germany changed, Japan changed, South Africa changed, my own country changed. My own country has changed so much that nobody who hasn't lived through it can even conceive the amount of change. I'll just give you one example, which was very striking to me, and you'll forgive the digression, but I do believe it's relevant. So with the miracle of YouTube, you get to watch programs from the 1950s and 1960s in my country. So you had what were called game shows. And the game shows were quite interesting because before the show begins and at the end of the show, the cameraman pans the audience, shows the whole audience. And you know what's the most striking thing? Everyone is white. It's not only there was no non-white people in front of the camera, there were no white people even allowed in the audience to just watch the game show. It's so striking now when you look at it. Our country underwent not just a political revolution with the civil rights movement, it underwent a cultural revolution. So I don't want to sound Pollyannish. On the other hand, even though I'm often accused of being unduly pessimistic, I do hold out a degree of optimism about the capacity of countries and people to change. I just don't think that's going to happen if you don't pay any price.
You're speaking about paying a price and accountability. South Africa did take Israel to the ICJ. You've also been investigating the judge, Julia Sebutinde, and it's come to fore recently now, her plagiarism. But you also believe that there's evidence that she's been blackmailed by Israel and everything else.
Not blackmail, I think probably bribed.
Okay, bribed. Apologies for that. Please do speak to what your findings are. But just before that, just a prelude to the answer to that, amidst everything that's gone on and what Israel's been able to get away with, and the realities that the American administration and to be honest with you, most powerful nations have allowed Israel to get away with, does the ruling even matter? Does law and what the precedence of law, does it actually even matter anymore?
Let's get to the nitty-gritty of what's been happening, and then we'll get to, does it even make a difference?
Okay.
So, again, we have to take a trip down memory lane. All countries practice the black arts. They have spies, they have agents, they carry on all sorts of nefarious activities. However, and here I have to be cautious because there are people who are more knowledgeable than myself. There are aspects of what Israel does in its practice of the black arts, which place it in my opinion, a separate category. And let me give you some illustrations. So, you will recall from our conversation a few moments ago, I said that Operation Cast Lead, even though now in retrospect seems like small change, at the time it evoked a huge international reaction. There were demonstrations in the millions in London. Yes, it was huge. At least 600,000 or 800,000, but I think it went into 1 million, but I could be wrong. Memory is not perfect. So, as a result of Operation Protective Edge, the United Nations commissioned a report, an investigation, what's called a Commission of Inquiry. And unprecedentedly, they chose as the head of the Commission of Inquiry a South African Jewish individual who was active in Jewish causes and a his self-description, a Zionist. His name was Richard Goldstone. And Goldstone went on a mission with 3 others, and he produced a devastating report on what Israel had done in Gaza. Utterly devastating. He didn't just limit himself to Gaza, he also talked about the West Bank and other things. And for Israel, this was a catastrophe because they couldn't use the usual epithets: self-hating Jew, Holocaust denier, and all the rest. It didn't stick with Richard Goldstone. He was a highly respected judge, and his Jewish bona fides couldn't be topped. Well, he was compared to, of all people, the Dr. Mengele of Auschwitz. He was just the wildest things were being said about him. And he weathered the storm. He weathered the storm. But then his report came out in 2009, I think, if my memory's right. And then on April 1st, 2010, in the United States, we have what's called April Fool's Day, which is the first day in April, and it's supposedly the day of pranks, where people do all sorts of pranks. On April 1st, the headline is Richard Goldstone retracts the report. He retracted. And there was no basis for the retraction. He made some arguments, but if you go through them, there's no basis. And that left really only one possibility. John Dugard, who was the senior counsel in the South African delegation at the International Court of Justice, like Goldstone, a respected jurist from South Africa, and he knew Goldstone. And he said, when Goldstone retracted the report, he said, there's no factual basis for the retraction. And then he went on to say, the secret of why Richard Goldstone retracted the report will probably go with him to his grave. And the only rational inference was that he was blackmailed by Israel. I personally don't believe it was him. His daughter lives in Israel. She uh, she became an Israeli citizen. You know, if you practice the black arts, everybody has a skeleton in their closet. Maybe this person had an affair. Maybe that person had a child out of wedlock. You find, you can always find dirt, you know? So I'm now going to fast forward. I'm just going to, you know, data points on the
Yep.
trajectory. Um, you had in the ICC, the International Criminal Court, which is different from the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. You had this character named Fatou Bensouda. She was the chief prosecutor on the ICC. She was the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Now, I mentioned already earlier, in May 31st, 2010, there was this humanitarian flotilla en route to Gaza to bring humanitarian aid. Israel attacked it, killed 9 people, and the 10th died later. The 10th was in a coma and then died later. Killed 10 people and committed all sorts of outrages against the other passengers. That became a uh, a case. What Israel did became a case before the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Now, this story you can't even make up. You can't make it up. The state which brought the case, the Comoros, I'm not going to go into why it was the Comoros, not so important. The Comoros brings the case, and Bensouda, the chief prosecutor, she declares, I'm not going to investigate this case. There's no basis for it. The Comoros appeal the case. They appeal Bensouda's decision. It goes before what's called the pretrial chamber of the ICC, PTC. Not so important. It goes before, let's just say it goes before the court. The court upholds the appeal. Okay? And then they say to Bensouda, the chief prosecutor, you have to re-examine this case. She claims to re-examine it, and for a second time says, I'm not going to pursue this case. It's appealed the second time by the Comoros. It goes before the court, the pretrial chamber. The second time, the pretrial chamber says, Ms. Bensouda, you are committing too many irregularities. You are committing just too many irregularities in this case. You have to revisit it. She then, a third time, she says, I am not going to pursue this case. The Comoros appeals a third time, and you know what the court says? What Bensouda did is so filled with errors, and not only old errors, new errors. But the court says, we have no legal remedies at this point, and they closed the appeal without granting the Comoros. And an obvious question arises. Why did she do this? There was a veritable civil war in the International Criminal Court because what she was doing was so completely outrageous. Why did she do it? Why? She wasn't a Zionist. She wasn't a Christian Zionist. She wasn't a Buddhist Zionist. She wasn't a Hindu Zionist. So that can't explain it. And again, the ever honorable, the ever honest John Dugard, he steps forward and he says, and he's the only one with the integrity. I won't use the word guts because that refers to a physical quality, having the guts. No, it's a moral quality. He's the only one who has the integrity to say, you know, Fatou Bensouda was the attorney general during the Gambian dictatorship. She was from the Gambia. She was accused of being complicit in torture. And what follows? She's being blackmailed. She's being blackmailed. That's why, to the complete outrage and indignation of the inner sanctums of the ICC, I'm not talking about like the Comoros, I'm talking about divisions within the ICC. Her conduct was so outrageous, but she persisted. Why? Why? What is the explanation? It cannot be that she was simply incompetent. No, that is not a persuasive explanation. There's another character who used to be, he had the highest rank in what was called pretrial chamber 1. Just let's call it the main court pretrial chamber in the ICC. A guy named Peter Kovacs from Hungary. Another crook. There's no other word for it. In July, I mean, these things you can't even make up. So there was a whole debate within the International Criminal Court before Karim Khan had issued his arrest warrants. There was this whole question. The ICC is a state-based system, organization. In other words, you can only be a state. You can only make a referral or a complaint. It's called a referral. You can only file a complaint if you are a state. And the question was whether the Palestinians constituted a state and were therefore eligible to file a complaint with the ICC. Okay? Because you have to be, let's say somebody in the street mugs you. I'm referring to you now.
Yes.
You can't go to the ICC and say, I want to refer the case of my mugging. Because you're not a state. You have to be a state in order to file a complaint. Well, there's this guy, Peter Kovacs, who the ICC, the pretrial chamber, ruled that it was a state, at least for now it's a state. I don't want to go into the technicalities, but for now it's a state, and that the ICC has jurisdiction over the situation in Palestine. The situation in Palestine meant basically the legality of the settlements that Israel is building, the crimes committed by Israel during Protective Edge, because this was before the Gaza, the last 15 months. And Peter Kovacs, he writes a dissent. Do you know how long the dissent was? I have it sitting on my shelf. I could show you. 245 pages. Now, nobody, you don't get paid enough to write 245-page dissents. Why did he do that? A dissent is usually 6 pages, 10 pages, maybe 15 pages. 245? No, there's something else going on there. Some of the footnotes were longer than the Bible. Yes, some of the footnotes were longer than the Bible. They were longer than War and Peace. And he did that on his own volition? No. Not believable. Not credible. Not persuasive. Now we come to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. As we all know, in January 2024, the ICJ rules or finds that Israel is plausibly committing genocide. About that, there seemed to be no disagreement about what it ruled, what it decided. It was reported everywhere. ICJ finds Israel plausibly commits genocide. And the head of the ICJ was Joan Donoghue from the United States. In April, she goes on the BBC program Hard Talk, and you know what she says? Oh, there's been a misunderstanding. We never found that Israel was plausibly committing genocide. You didn't find that? Everybody got it wrong? Legal specialists, legal experts, revered authorities, the most distinguished names in the international legal community, they all got it wrong? It was such a brazen, flat out lie, so audacious that she didn't even fear the reaction of all the other members of the court. She had already stepped down. Her term of office had ended. But she didn't even fear the reaction as she pronounced this audacious, outrageous lie. And then we have the curious case, which is now in the news, of Julia Sebutinde from Uganda. And she was on the court, the vice president, during the genocide case. Okay? Now, for the sake of your listeners, just a point of clarity. The genocide case did not end on January 26th with the court's finding that Israel is plausibly committing genocide. The genocide continued, and South Africa valiantly tried to get something practically done, not just the rulings, but something practically done. It went back to the court in February. It went back to the court in March. It went back to the court in May. And in January, when the original ruling was handed down, Julia Sebutinde wrote, I think it was an 8-page dissent. And then in May, that was the ruling your listeners might remember. That was the ruling where the court said Israel can't launch that military offensive in Rafah. She wrote a 28-page dissent. Again, very unusual. This investment of energy and time. Dissents just don't read like that. There are 2 or 3 pages, 5 pages, And I have studied closely the whole documentary record, to the point, I will frankly admit, because most people will agree with this point by me, to the point of insanity. There'll be agreement by everybody on that particular point. Everyone listening, friend and foe alike, to the point of insanity. And it was clear that what Julia Sebutinde was writing in her dissents was completely crazy. A simple example. South Africa was very careful in its presentation, what's called application to the court, and then the application was January, but then after January, the sources it cited. South Africa adopted a very smart strategy. I guess it was natural to them, but for me, it was very clever. Remember, the ICJ is the highest judicial body of the United Nations. It's the legal arm of the United Nations, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. So what did South Africa do? Its first application was 84 pages, single-spaced, and all it did, it had 590 footnotes. Yes. And each footnote had multiple references. And they were very careful. They only cited humanitarian organizations and UN organizations for their evidence, for their proof that a genocide was going on in Gaza. So they'll cite the World Health Organization. They'll cite CARE. They'll cite Save the Children. They'll cite UNICEF. They'll cite UNESCO. These are, in general, unimpeachable sources, but they're much more unimpeachable because this is the legal arm of the UN, and South Africa is only citing UN sources. So to say that the sources are false is in effect to discredit the whole UN organization. And that was, in my opinion, it was a quite very clever strategy because the judges, a lot of them, I don't think they wanted to vote that Israel's plausibly committing genocide, but they were in a very uncomfortable position. If they didn't vote along, they're in effect saying UNESCO, UNICEF, Save the Children, CARE, World Health Organization, they're all liars. That's not a smart move. It's not a credible move, you know. So what does Sebutinde do? Her only response is to cite Israeli state claims. The Israelis claim this, the Israelis claim that. That's not a response. First of all, you have to show why the UN sources are wrong. You can't cite Netenyahu against who? The World Health Organization. She doesn't even make a pretense of justifying her dissents. And then there was another aspect. I can't go into everything. The chapter I wrote on her in my forthcoming book, the chapter is 59 pages. But then there's another aspect. When I read Judge Sebutinde's, her second major dissent in May, when I read her dissent when the ICJ declared Israel's occupation illegal, that dissent was in July 2024. That I told you that one ran to 28 pages. No. That
one in May was 28 pages.
Excuse me?
You said earlier the one in May was 28 pages.
Yeah, I was mistaken. The one in the legal consequence, it's called the legal consequences of Israel's policies and practices in the occupied territories. That one ran to 28 pages, okay? And when I read it, it was such a bizarre dissent. I said, no. She couldn't have written this. She couldn't have even known these facts. They're so obscure. She couldn't have done that. And so I assumed she plagiarized from somewhere, or somebody plagiarized for her. And I decided, I went on my Twitter account, which for me, humble person from Brooklyn, New York, no connections, nobody likes me, a pariah. And I know nothing about web technology. 0.00000 minus 1. Nothing. So I posted on my Twitter account, I said, would anyone care to volunteer to help me track down some plagiarism? I believe there's plagiarism, but I'm not certain. And about 20 people submitted contributions. I gave them the Sebutinde descent. And I said, look it over. And they were of uneven quality. Some, they found 2 or 3 things. Some people found 10 and 12 instances of dissent. But then this fellow named Majid Abu Amer, he weighs in. It turns out he's a young fellow from Gaza, of all places, and he currently resides in Doha. Okay? And he submits 35 double columns of plagiarism. 35 pages, double columns, juxtaposing what she says with the plagiarized material. Okay? And he's very precise. He finds 32.2% of her dissent was plagiarized. Almost entirely from these hack Israeli sources, these apologists, and I think that's a euphemism for Israel. So a third. I know I'm not allowed to say a third. I have to say almost a third. I have to be precise. 32.2% has been plagiarized. And I'm happy actually to give him credit, first of all, because of the brilliant work that he did, outshining a lot of people in the West who had first-rate abilities, capacities on the web. He, so to speak, beat them out. But also, on a note of pathos, it tells you something about all the human talent that was squandered and destroyed by Israel in Gaza. I've met so many really impressive people from Gaza. When I was at the encampment at MIT last year, which is the most respected science and engineering university in our country and probably still in the world, the MIT and Caltech, California Institute of Technology. And I met 3 young Gazans who were students there. And then when I can go through it, but you see so much talent, so much ability, so much goodness, so much decency. So I'm very happy to acknowledge the brilliant work that he did. And my conclusion, I know people say I am prone to exaggeration. I am prone to hyperbole, which is the fancy word for exaggeration. But the fact of the matter is, I began my, so to speak, professional career, which was not a professional career because I never got a job in academia. You are looking at a person who was unemployed his whole life. I never had a job. I would do what's called in the United States adjuncting, which means you get a contract for a semester, and maybe you'll get a contract the next semester, and maybe you won't. And a semester is only 14 weeks. So even if I got a contract for 2 semesters, that's just 28 weeks. And frequently I didn't get the second semester contract. I never had a job. But I had, as it were, a career. Or I prefer to call it a calling, a commitment. And In the course of my life, at a young age, when I was still a graduate student, there was this book that came out called From Time Immemorial by this person named Joan Peters, and it was a national sensation. It was about the Israel-Palestine conflict. I won't go into the details. And this young graduate student outwitted and outsmarted all the experts who said this book would transform our understanding of the Israel-Palestine conflict. In fact, hold on. I keep it here. So you have blurbs that say, by leading authorities, this book is a historical event in itself, a discovery that has lain in the dark all along until the revelations by the author. And as a young man, I went through it very carefully, and I concluded it was a hoax, it was a fraud. And I was vindicated. And I can name many points along my life's journey. There was a case of Daniel Goldhagen, who had written a book on the Nazi Holocaust, which I considered complete, I believe was complete nonsense. And I believe I also demonstrated it was complete nonsense. I wrote a book on the subject with somebody else. I'll take it off the shelf. A Nation on Trial. And with Ruth Bettina Byrne, my co-author, and it was named one of the top books of the year by the New York Times Book Review. And I had a succession of, I think, revelations which were subsequently affirmed and confirmed by the general academic public. And now it's my opinion that there is an ugly, sordid, squalid pattern that you could see with Richard Goldstone, you could see with Fatou Bensouda, you can see with Joan Donahue, and now you can see with Judge Sebutinde, who, when Youssef Salam was the president of the ICJ, and now he was elevated to high office in Lebanon, and he was replaced as the president of the ICJ by Julia Sebutinde. So she is currently the president, and I believe she is in thrall to the state of Israel. The chapter is entitled Free Agent or Foreign Agent. I believe it's the latter. She's a foreign agent. As I said, I devoted 59 pages, single space, to analyzing her dissents, and then I appended the 35 pages by Majid Abu Amer documenting the massive plagiarism. I'll just say one last thing on this subject, which is plagiarism is what you can call a form of professional misconduct. It's the cardinal sin in academia to plagiarize. But with recognizing the significance of that, I believe that the far greater issue is not the professional one, professional misconduct. She didn't properly credit her sources. The real issue is the political one. The presidency of the ICJ, which still has to hear that genocide case, because right now they've not heard it. What they heard was the request for what are called provisional measures. The request for provisional measures means, very simply, there may be a genocide going on in Gaza, and unless the court does something, it'll be too late by the time the court rules on whether it's genocide. So we're asking for provisional measures so that the people will still be around when the court hears the case. It's the equivalent in domestic law of asking a court for an order of restraint. Namely, you haven't yet been proven guilty, but we're issuing an order of restraint just in case it's too late by the time the case goes to court. Or so it's called a restraining order. I believe in the basis of the evidence that the ICJ, like the chief prosecutor of the ICC, Fatou Bensouda, that they have been captured by a foreign government, the state of Israel.
So just coming back to the question, does international law matter, given what Israel has done?
Obviously, if there's no enforcement mechanism, and South Africa, it did submit, I'm actually reading it now, I'll just show it to you. Hold it up. It did submit in May of 2024 a voluminous document. The essence of the document was that the ICJ said Israel is plausibly committing genocide. We are now presenting you this document to show that they have not relented, even though the ICJ ordered them to allow in humanitarian aid, even though the ICJ ordered them not to launch the offensive in Rafah, the Israelis went ahead and did it anyway. And so they submitted this document to the Security Council and requested the Security Council to act on the findings of the International Court of Justice. And obviously, as you know, it didn't happen because the US blocks it. However, even though the enforcement mechanism for the findings of the ICJ the enforcement mechanism is inoperative because of the US veto, notwithstanding that, these are important weapons in the battle for public opinion. And that's our strongest weapon. Our strongest weapon, we don't have the money. We don't have the organization. We don't have the power, the raw power. But we have the possibility of reaching people, of trying to organize into a compact force public opinion. And Israel and Israelis worry about that. That's why they blackmailed Richard Goldstone. That's why they blackmailed Fatou Bensouda. That's why Peter Kovacs wrote a 245. You can't imagine how insane this is. 245-page dissent. So they are concerned. They don't like it. They don't like it, even though it's true, they don't have the enforce. They have disabled the enforcement mechanism. That's true. They have disabled it. That's correct. But public opinion, yes, they do worry about it. I was at Yale about a month ago. I was invited by the Yale Political Union to speak. Now, the mere fact that they invited me is already so over the top, that they would invite me to come speak. And you know what the topic was? What the resolution was? Israel's committing genocide in Gaza. Yes, that was the resolution. Resolved, Israel's committing genocide in Gaza. I gave the way the format at Yale is, there's a keynote speaker who gives a presentation, and then students on both sides argue the proposition. 3 students in favor of the proposition, Israel is committing genocide, 3 students against. Okay? Well, I carried the day. They did the vote at the end, and it was 2/3 in support of me and 1/3 opposed. And they're not happy about that, the Israelis. Is it the equivalent of an atomic bomb? No. But does it trouble them? Yes. It troubles them that they are becoming, and it may endure, they're becoming a pariah state. They're assuming the status that South Africa did for my generation. And the status was one of a visceral, not just a mental, a visceral reaction of disdain whenever you heard somebody was from South Africa. You didn't, you could be a young kid, I mean, serious, you just knew it was in the air after a certain point. It permeated the atmosphere. You just knew if somebody said they were from South Africa, there's something wrong. There's something wrong. There were 2 famous golfers. The most famous golfer of my generation was a fellow named Arnold Palmer. And his partner was a guy named Gary Player. And Gary Player was from South Africa. And whenever they would say that, you knew there was something wrong there. And Israel is assuming that status. It's assuming that status. I feel it in myself. I met somebody the other day. I said, so where are you from? And he said, Israel. And I immediately got this sick feeling inside me. No, I don't like genocidal states. Nice knowing you. So I do think, one has to be realistic about these things. You will not have any knowledge of the fact, because it's such an obscure chapter now. South Africa controlled Namibia, what was called back then Southwest Africa.
I'm South African, so I do know about this.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Now, believe it or not, the case of South Africa's control of Namibia, it came before the International Court of Justice 7 times. 7 times between 1950 and 1971. Okay? Finally, South Africa was ordered to leave Namibia. Finally, by 1971, it was ordered to leave Namibia. Now, you can say skeptically, what difference did it make? But I kind of agree with John Dugard, who wrote the definitive book on that ICJ ordeal journey, those 7 cases. He said, no, it didn't end apartheid, but he said it played a role. It was one forum. We all operate in different forums. At some points, we all get together in mass demonstrations where all of us, from the doctors, lawyers, and professors to the people who make our society run on a daily basis. We all get together as a show of force, of our collective power, our compact power. But most of the time, each of us is doing his or her own thing in his or her own realm. Physicians are doing one thing, they journey to Gaza, they give testimony on what they saw and experienced in Gaza. Professors do another thing. You know, one of the deeply moving things about the encampments was how professors, they didn't know what to do to show solidarity. So they were just sending food and more food and more food. They did their thing. You know, we all do our thing in our own separate capacities, in our own distinct competences. And I believe that this is one realm, one area, the law, where it makes a contribution, but I will never pretend to the fact that it's the be all and end all.
You've spoken a lot. I mean, there's two things I want to touch on now. The one was you spoke about, I forget his name, but the Palestinian researcher in Doha from Gaza.
Majid Abu Amer.
Majid Abu Amer. And you speak about him and the potential that Israel has destroyed in Gaza. I mean, just very briefly, because obviously I think you know that you do like to speak, and you do speak a lot of sense, so that's good. But the time is going. But just briefly, try to give us a sense of, because I mean, I think a lot of our viewers would know that, because a lot of our viewers, obviously, we cover Palestine extensively, and so a lot of them would be aware. But just give us a sense of how Israel sort of played the victim card, and has worked so hard to kind of push the Palestinians into this point where October 7th happened. Because obviously it's been a long journey for Palestinians and Palestinian resistance, and I think there's often an impression that, you know, the resistance is just a bit mindless, and I'm sure the resistance is flawed because they operate in a very difficult environment. But just kind of like, you know, speak to that.
Well, you put a severe limitation on me. You said be brief.
Okay, be a bit brief, not too brief.
That's like a death sentence. Where does one begin? I think the best place to begin, people can disagree, obviously. I think the best place to begin is 1948. And 1948 represents the climax of a project that began at the end of the 19th century. The climax is the formation of the State of Israel. In the course of Israel's formation, about 90% of the population of what became Israel is expelled. It's about, the rough estimates are about 750,000 Palestinians are expelled. Of those 750,000, approximately 270,000, 300,000 end up in Gaza. And so that's the first fact that we have to always bear in mind, that Gaza is overwhelmingly a refugee population, refugees and their descendants, who under international law, the descendants are also classified as refugees. Gaza is also overwhelmingly a child population. It's about 48% children. Now, again, I'm often accused, I believe, incorrectly, of being extreme in my language or of being exaggerating in my language. So I will refer to what others have said. One of the striking things when you go back to the beginning of the creation of Gaza as we know it is that one outside observer after another, they routinely refer to Gaza as a concentration camp. Now, that's not me. And it's not as if memories of World War II have been obscured. We're talking about right after 1948. So you talk about the chief a UN representative in Gaza. His name is E.L.M. Burns, and he writes a memoir. And he says, well, there's not starvation that's in the streets. You don't see starvation in the streets. But he said, Gaza's a huge concentration camp on the sand. That's what it is. By the way, Israelis in all sectors of Israeli life refer to Gaza under Egyptian administration. We're talking about between 1950 and 1967. When it's under Egyptian administration, Burns calls it a concentration camp. The Israelis keep referring to it as a concentration camp. Then in 1967, in July, the father of Al Gore, people will remember as the American who ran for president in 2000, his father was also a senator. He goes to Gaza. He comes back, reports. Now it's under Israeli rule. It's after 67. He comes back. He reports to Congress, and he refers to Gaza as a concentration camp. Then, in 2002, a senior Israeli sociologist, Baruch Kimmerling, he writes a book on the occupation when Ariel Sharon was the prime minister. He describes Gaza as, quote, the biggest concentration camp ever. In 2004, the then head of the National Security Council, Gira Island, who's still around, he's playing a most nefarious role the past 15 months during the Israeli genocide in Gaza. How did he describe Gaza? Quote, the head of the Israeli National Security Council describes it as, quote, a huge concentration camp. That was Gaza. Now, in 2006, Hamas wins the parliamentary elections. The parliamentary elections, incidentally, which President Bush demanded. It was the era of what was called democracy promotion after the Israeli-U.S. attack on Iraq. And they demand elections. Hamas doesn't want to participate because it says this is part of the Oslo process, what began in 1993. We don't want to have anything to do with Oslo process. We don't want to have anything to do with these elections. It's all a facade for Israeli control. Well, they're finally persuaded to participate in the elections. And in elections, according to Jimmy Carter, the American president who just passed away, he described the elections as completely honest and fair. And lo and behold, Hamas wins. Immediately as it wins, elections which the U.S. government demanded, immediately as Hamas wins, Israel poses this brutal economic blockade on Gaza. And then Israel is followed by the United States and the EU, European Union. And now at this point, Hamas engages because it's an elected government. And it was elected on the hopes, it ran on what was called a reform platform. And it had to deliver on its platform. Otherwise, it's going to be voted out. And so the first order of business has to be to end this blockade, which everybody agrees is destroying Gaza. And it tried many things. First of all, it tried diplomacy. It was sending signals which were acknowledged by U.S. government agencies. It was sending signals that was prepared to terminate the conflict on the basis of international law, namely 2 states along the June 1967 border. Now, I will admit, I have a credo in life, never quarrel with facts. I'm not going to dispute there were gray areas in Hamas's response. Hamas was formally committed to the exercise of the full right of return of the refugees. Now, under international law, they have a very strong case. They have a very strong case under international law that refugees have a right of return. But as a practical matter, I don't believe it's realistic. I don't want to get into this. I'm just saying I will acknowledge that the Hamas response was not perfect, but it certainly was serious. And they had a real dilemma. You have to remember, 80%, 70% of Gaza is refugees. So they couldn't very easily give up that right of return. That's their constituency. But all of their attempts to resolve the conflict diplomatically were ignored. They were simply ignored. Then they tried international law. Here is a little known fact. As I mentioned earlier, there were these commissions of inquiry after each of Israel's horrors in Gaza. Now, the commissions of inquiry were not soft on Hamas. Not at all. They accused Hamas of war crimes, of serious war crimes. Okay? Hamas cooperated with the commissions of inquiry. It knew that the final reports of these commissions of inquiry would come to a very harsh judgment on Hamas, indeed accusing them of war crimes. That didn't deter them because they believed that maybe, even as they're accused of war crimes, they would get some justice because Israel also would be held to account, which is what Richard Goldstone did and the others did. What came of it? All these reports, and they were put in the desk drawer to collect dust. They tried. Remember, Israel refused to cooperate with any of the commissions of inquiry. Refused up until today. The Navi Pillay Commission of Inquiry, they say no, they're not going to cooperate. Richard Goldstone, they say no, we're not going to cooperate. Mary McGowan Davis, after Operation Protective Edge, no, we won't cooperate. Hamas cooperated. It cooperated. That's a fact. And what did they get out of the cooperation? They got reports which were never acted on. They just collected dust. And then they tried nonviolent civil resistance. In March 2018, the Great March of Return. They tried nonviolent civil resistance. What came of that? We know exactly what came of it. There was a 250-page Commission of Inquiry report. And you know what the inquiry found? It quoted Israel saying that they lined up their best snipers along the perimeter fence with Gaza. The Israelis said every bullet fired hit its mark. That's what they said. Every bullet fired by these top snipers hit their mark. Who did they target? The UN 250-page single-space report said they targeted children, journalists, medics, disabled people, double amputees who are 100 to 300 meters away from the perimeter fence and engaging in strictly civilian activities. When they didn't kill the nonviolent demonstrators, they targeted their kneecap and below in order to inflict life-changing injuries. So, the documentary record shows they tried diplomacy, they tried law, They tried nonviolent civil resistance. And on the night of October 6th, Gaza had vanished from the news. I know because I abandoned Gaza. I gave up after chronicling it in minute detail for more than a decade. I reached the conclusion this is pointless, it's worthless, it's hopeless, time to move on. I wasn't proud of that decision. There was an element of shame in that decision, but I made it. And it looked as if the Abraham Accords would extend to Saudi Arabia, and the people of Gaza would be left to die in that concentration camp. The young men who burst the gates of Gaza on October 7th, they were all around 20. They were born into, they languished in, and they died. They were destined, they were fated to die in that concentration camp with the only break in the monotony of getting up each morning and pacing the perimeter of Gaza, because 60% of them were unemployed, the young men. 60% were unemployed. The only break in the monotony of their existence was the periodic high-tech killing sprees, Israel's mowings of the lawn in Gaza. And they were born into, they languished in, and as of October 6th, they had been abandoned by the whole of humanity without exception, and they were destined to die there. Those who want to criticize them, in my opinion, they have to first show me what option did they have that they didn't exploit.
Just moving on to a bit about yourself, and I know you don't want to speak too much about yourself, but it is to inform the audience just about what motivates you and what kind of drives you. Why did you? I mean, at what point in your life did you decide that you're gonna study what you have studied, which to a large extent is the conflict? What moments in your life led you there?
I came from my parents passed through the Nazi Holocaust. It was omnipresent in my home growing up. It was omnipresent even though there wasn't all that much talk about it. There were pictures of my mother's family hanging on the wall, but I never made a connection, or what you might call the normal connection, between those pictures and myself. So I would never refer to the picture of my mother's mother. I would never refer to it as my grandmother. I would say my mother's mother. And I would never refer to the two sisters and her brother, the picture that hung on the wall. I never referred to them as my
Aunts and
aunts and uncle. They were just my mother's two sisters and brother. They never, to this day, my parents passed 30 years ago this year in 1995. To this day, I have no idea whatsoever what happened to my parents' family. None. It was though that was an area that was roped off. You can talk about Hitler, you can talk about the Nazis, you can talk about this, you can talk about that, but you couldn't talk about the family. Impossible. Nobody. I would never dare, and neither did my brothers, to ask them. Actually, in my own case, I was afraid. I was afraid because I didn't believe I was emotionally capable of handling the outpouring of grief. I could not, I was not physically capable of hearing what happened. So we never talked about it. We did talk a lot about politics. It was a very political home. And it was an eccentric political home. My parents remained to their last breath loyal and faithful to Comrade Stalin because it was the Russian Red Army that defeated the Nazis. And that's all they cared about. Nothing else mattered. Uh, so it was a political home. I was, like my entire generation, I was involved in the anti-war movement, and also to the extent that I was able to support the rights of African Americans. I only came to Israel Palestine quite late in my life, 1982. So I'm already 29 years old. It was when Israel invaded Lebanon in June 1982. I got involved for reasons which are not worth going into. I ended up writing my doctoral dissertation on the theory of Zionism. So now I had a political investment. I had a professional investment with my doctoral dissertation. And then there was always the personal investment because my parents were authentic survivors of the Nazi Holocaust. And obviously, that was a reference in Israeli propaganda. So my personal family history uh, played a part in my commitment. So there was a political, a personal, and a professional. All P's, I didn't realize that. The personal, the professional, and the political commitment. And the bottom line is I'm not a quitter. The conflict didn't end. And so long as the conflict didn't end, I wasn't prepared to give up until, as I said, 2020, when I walked away. And then 3 years later, I was back at it. I had so put it out of my mind that I had to start. I was going to be debating fairly early on in the Israeli genocide. I was going to be on a debate that included Benny Morris, the Israeli historian. And he's obviously very knowledgeable. So I had to sit down and start rereading books to refresh my memory on Gaza. So I'm back at it.
Just again on a personal level, how has witnessing this genocide for the last 15 months, how has it changed you?
I haven't witnessed it. I will be honest with you. I don't watch any images from Gaza. I don't watch any videos from Gaza. I get obviously in my email each morning tons of videos I should watch and images I should look at. I never do. I don't. Uh, I just don't do it. I bury myself in the sand. I always thought that God's wisest creation was the ostrich. Bury your head in the sand, ignore what's going on in front of you, behind you, and in each side of you, and just do your work. And I work myself to the point of literally physical exhaustion because I believe I can perform a useful service now, and I should. And many people have come to count on me. I have received a large amount of email each day from people thanking me, and also in particular, not just for my resoluteness, but also for the information I provide. And I am uniquely uh, competent in this matter because I spent a good 15 years of my life just going through all of these reports and all of this documentation. It sits on my bookshelves now. Uh, you can see my entire life really is on the bookshelves. I didn't do much else. And so it's not a, I don't believe it's conceited to say there's one economic history of Gaza uh, book form. That's Sarah Roy from Harvard, her book, The De-Development of Gaza. And there's only one political history of Gaza, and that's my own, Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom. So I found myself in an unusual situation of a conflict which has been on the front pages for 15 months, and where I had more than what you would call the average amount of knowledge.
Given your vast study into the Palestinian and Israeli conflict, war, genocide, ethnic cleansing, whatever we want to call it, do you think this is the lowest point, just analytically speaking, that the Palestinian cause has been at, given what you've said previously in this interview?
There's the physical facts and there are the political facts. As I said, during the Vietnam War, the United States was dropping at its peak the equivalent of 2 atomic bombs on Vietnam. They totally destroyed the environment of Vietnam by its promiscuous use of Agent Orange, which contaminated the soil in in Vietnam. However, the Vietnamese Communist Party was very tough. I once asked a high-ranking member of the party, how did you survive this relentless? Really, it begins in 1945 when the French attempt to reconquer Vietnam. Then the United States enters the picture and extends to 1970, 75 when the US finally withdraws. And he said it was the Communist Party was so committed, so you might say maniacal in its commitment to win. So when you ask me the question of the lowest point, I think materially this is the lowest point. Obviously, 1948 was a catastrophe, but I don't believe in terms of numbers killed that remotely approaches what's happened the past 15 months. But politically, I would say that the Palestinian movement was destroyed long before, when the ostensible leadership switched sides and became collaborators with the Israelis, which was the essence of the Oslo Accord. And there was no longer that compact, fanatical, monomaniacal commitment to the cause. Now it was just a gang of crooks who were capitalizing on their status as collaborators with Israel. There is no, we have to be honest about it, there's no resistance in the West Bank to what happened in Gaza. There was not. Now, there is reason for that. It's not just the corrupt leadership, but there is an absence of vision. Namely, if you're going to give your life up, you have to give it for a cause. Otherwise, you're not going to give up your life. Your life is the most sacred thing to you. And people, they go and they demonstrate, they're not sure what they're demonstrating for. There's no leadership. And they're not willing to die without even the hope of achieving something, because they don't know what what they're trying to achieve. There's no leadership. But the fact of the matter is, the Palestinian people, Israel achieved one of its goals. One of its goals was to divide Gaza from the West Bank, not just physically, but as a consequence of physically to divide it in terms of its emotional national allegiances. And Gaza became a separate entity. The people of the West Bank went on with their lives as if a genocide was not happening in Gaza. By the way, that happened during World War II, you know. There's been quite a lot, not a lot, but there's been significant literature about how Jews in the Yishuv, which was what was YISHUV, it's the pre-Jewish, the pre-state Jewish community in Palestine, pre-state, pre-1948, they went on as life as usual during the Nazi extermination. They did nothing. They went on as usual, so it's not unusual that that happens. American Jews did barely anything for Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe. Barely anything. A demonstration here, a demonstration there. You can count them the fingers of one hand. But politically, you have to remember that you take the first Intifada that began in December 7th, 1987. If you take the first Intifada, it starts in Jabalia camp in Gaza. And then within a week, it spreads to the West Bank. There was still a cohesion. If it starts here, in the blink of an eye, it's going to spread there. That doesn't exist anymore. If you go back and look during the Great March of Return in 2018, there was no support for it in West Bank. None. So politically, I think the disaster occurred much earlier.
Dr. Norman Finkelstein, thank you so much for your time. There's a lot more that I would like to speak to you about, but I think this has been a very long session.
Yes,
but well, it's good that you agree on that.
yes.
But thank you so much for your time, your patience today, and everything else. And yeah, thank you. And we hope to be speaking to you again at some point in the future.
Okay. If I'm still around.
I hope you will be. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.